Good afternoon. We're continuing. We have been discussing that basically when we're talking about the tree, we're talking about how God is one, not whether he's one. And we said that there are necessary conditions to the Trinity, that really what you would need is one deity, or deity that is the one deity that has attributes in line with that. You need distinctions within that deity, and then you need those distinctions to be personal at the same time. The Bible ends up indicating there is a mystery to God's oneness. By the way, there wouldn't be much of a mystery to God's oneness if it was a Unitarian type of oneness. If there was one God and one person, there wouldn't be much of a mystery to his oneness. But if there's one God who is multi-personal or tri-personal, then there is a real mystery to his oneness. Is there allowance for that mystery? We're going to look at two ways that we can end up seeing this sort of mystery to God's oneness. One is the Shekinah glory. Now let me explain that term. That's a Hebrew term. It refers to God's glorious dwelling presence, the Shekinah or Shekinah. And then we're going to look at the angel of the Lord. By the way, these are things that are regarded as quasi-divine beings during the Second Temple period. Again, I don't really like quasi, so we'll say beings that exhibit divine attributes, but are beings that have a separate title and appear distinctly in the Scriptures. So let's talk about the angel of the Lord. There are two passages that are really neat with demonstrating this with the angel of the Lord. I'm going to turn to one of them. You can go to Genesis 22. Now what I love about this is this passage of Scripture is known as the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. It actually appears in the Jewish prayer book. By the way, this is also a passage that appears in the Kran. Now, it doesn't say Isaac in the Quran, it says Abraham's son, but the point is this incident is there. Is it recorded exactly the same way? No, it's not recorded exactly the same way. It's important to understand that this is an incident that really plays a part in the tradition or the narrative of both Judaism and Islam. And I want to take you to just the beginning of this. I have a whole message on the binding of Isaac because it is such a beautiful picture in the big story of Messiah in some unique ways. But let's start. It came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here am I, or here I am, Hanani in the Hebrew. And he said, now take your son, your only son Isaac. Now, it doesn't appear that way in the Quran, but we know we have inspired text here. Whom you love, to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will tell you. This is really an incredible story. Abraham rose early in the morning. He saddled his donkey and took the two young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place that God had told him. You could do so much. There's so much rich text here. You do need to understand that it came to pass after these things. These things are the things in the previous chapters in the context. And in 21, Isaac is born, the son of promise, who Abraham waited so long for. And 2, Hagar and Ishmael depart. Then there's a covenant with Abimelech, and it's after these things. God took Abraham through a process of building his faith before he ever asked this of Abraham. And Abraham doesn't sleep in verse 3. He rose early. He ends up splitting the wood for the burnt offering. I tried splitting wood when we lived in Vermont. It's a lot of work. They used to say that wood heated you two ways. One is splitting and the other not. He rises up early and he starts heading towards the place God had talked to him about, the area that he was supposed to be. In verse 4, on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes. It's one Hebrew word, lifted up, and then the word for his, the form of the noun for his eyes. It's the first place where it states Abraham lifted up his eyes. That Hebrew phrase appears in two places within this pericope, this section of Scripture here. He lifted up his eyes. He saw the place from afar. Abraham said to the young men, there were two young men with him, helping him in the Yiddish, schlep his stuff, carry his stuff. And he said to them, now this is interesting, stay here with the donkey. I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Well, wait a minute. Abraham's supposed to sacrifice his son as a burnt offering. Hebrews, which was written to a Jewish audience of believing followers of Messiah. Actually, that's a little redundant. Followers of Messiah ends up talking about this passage in greater detail. And if we weren't doing this apologetic sermon, I would be glad to take you there. But he took the wood for the burnt offering. He puts it on his son Isaac's back. Isaac is not a little kid. He's a young man, and Abraham is a very old man. And Isaac's carrying the wood for his own burnt offering, which is absolutely incredible. A knife, and the two of them went off together. Now in verse 7, Isaac spoke to Abraham and said, "My father." And he said, "Here am I, my son." Then he said, "Look, here's fire, we've got wood, where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Now Abraham could have said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, you are the burnt offering, and I'm going to be tying you to an altar, killing you, and then totally burning you up." That's not what Abraham ends up saying, but what Abraham does say ends up being prophetic. Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering." So the two of them went together. Now Isaac really had to trust Abraham to go ahead and buy that and not think something sort of rotten near Mount Moriah here. This doesn't look too good for me. What's left to burn? They came to the place that God had told them. Abraham builds the altar. All the while, I mean, the emotional turmoil must be incredible. He placed the wood in order. He bound his son. That's where the word Akedah or Akedah comes from. He bound his son. He laid him on the altar. Abraham stretches out his hand to take the knife to slay his son. Now notice the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Hanani, here am I." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now that I know you fear God." So far so good, right folks? "Since you have not withheld your only son from me." Whoops. Wait a minute now. It was God that commanded Abraham to do this. It was God that expected Abraham to do this, but Abraham has not withheld his only son from the angel of the Lord. That indicates that the angel of the Lord must be deity. Well, wait a minute. Now, the angel of the Lord is speaking. At the beginning of this, God ended up calling to Abraham. The angel of the Lord is being named specifically and distinctly. By the way, the phrase in Hebrew is different. It's not just a reiteration of God. This is not poetry where the two sections end up saying the same thing a different way. This is narrative. This is story. You have God appear as a character in verse 1. You have the angel of the Lord appear as a character separately. There's distinctions. The angel of the Lord spoke to Abraham. Hey, folks, that's pretty personal. People speak to people. That's personal. That's distinction. And so you seem to start seeing these things emerge. And it appears like the angel of the Lord is a deity there. Now, that's only one place. But we're starting to get these hints, aren't we? That something's going on here, that this angel of the Lord allows for plurality, a mystery to God's oneness. God's God, but the angel of the Lord seems to be God, but God is God, but the angel of the Lord seems to be distinct from God. God speaks, the angel of the Lord speaks. That's kind of personal. Something's going on here that allows for a mystery to God's oneness. But let's go to Exodus chapter 3. Now, I haven't even left what Jewish people would refer to as the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. This is all Torah. No one can object there. This is another great story. I actually have a message, The God Who Visits, based on this passage. This is really cool. And this is when Moses gets his commission. Moses is tending the flock of his father, Jethro. And he led the flock to the back of the desert to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of flame of fire in the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, and it was not consumed. Now, that's something you don't see every day. If you're a Bullwinkle fan, you'd see one character turning to the other and saying, now that's something you don't see every day, Chauncey. And that's what you have going on here. And Moses is a little fascinated because in verse 3 he says, now I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. This is another passage, by the way, that appears in the Kran. interestingly enough. And I remember talking to some Muslim men based on this passage. This passage really is just ripe with doctrine when you place it in a big story. And so Moses turns, and look at verse 4. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside, that being Moses, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses answers the way Abraham did. Hanani, here am I. And he says, do not draw near to this place. Take off your sandals, for the ground you stand on is holy ground. That's going to be important because, you see, it's just dirt. What makes it holy ground is that God is present. And he ends up telling him to do that, and he says, look, beyond this, look at verse 6. I am the God of your father. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look. And so we're looking at this passage here, and we end up seeing that the angel of the Lord appeared from the midst of the frame. But wait a minute. God appears from the midst of the frame, and this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God is repeatedly referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Jewish prayer book, and called that by Jewish people. And he repeatedly takes that name in the scriptures. And so Moses sees that God is speaking to him in the midst of the bush, but the angel of the Lord is speaking to him from the midst of the bush. And something is going on here, because God is God, and the angel of the Lord appears to be God, but the angel of the Lord is named separately and distinctly from God, and both of them seem to be pretty personal here, and so something's going on. Can I go further with this? Well, yeah, I can look at the Shekinah glory in greater detail, and so I want to do that. Again, we need that distinction and personhood. And you could say things that have the same essential properties at the same time in the same way are the same. This phone has certain essential properties that it wouldn't be an Android phone without. It'd have to have a certain operating system that Android puts in their phone. It has a general shape because it's a Note 4. It has a little stylus. Wouldn't need that as an essential property, but the place for the stylus is part of the design, and it has these essential characteristics. I am male. If I wasn't male, I would not be Jeff. I would be someone else. We call these essential attributes or characteristics in philosophy. And it has to have the essential characteristics at the same time, in the same way, in order to be the same thing. And if it has that, it has those. So let's see. We talked about the Shekinah. We said some sort of mystery is going on here. And so let's go a little further and dig a little deeper. Okay. Now this is an incredible passage. This is Exodus 16, 7 through 7 through right there in 7:16, and I'm going to turn there to Exodus 16 to show you this passage, because this is a really great passage. This is one of my favorite places to go because it really demonstrates this really well. And I'm going right over here to 7. Okay. The people are complaining. This is when manna appears. The Hebrew word manna is sort of what is it? And they're complaining about the food supply. That really occurs in the verses above. And there are instructions given. And they have complained. And in verse 7, in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, the Shekinah, the Shekinah, the glory of the Lord. That's the phrase used, for he hears your complaints against the Lord. But what are we that you should complain against us? And Moses says, this shall be seen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to your fill. For the Lord hears your complaints which you make against him. And what are we that your complaints are against us? What are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. Now here's what you need to see. Wrapping up, the Shekinah hears the complaints of the children of Israel. That's pretty personal. The Shekinah is separate because you have two subjects in the same context with different actions. They're both hearing, but they're both hearing separately. And the Shekinah is hearing the complaints against the Lord. So you have these two subjects. You have different actions because the Shekinah is hearing the complaints against the Lord separately, and the Lord's hearing the complaints. And so you have two different subjects with different actions in the same context. You have two entities. The glory of the Lord is God. The Lord is God. They're personal. They're distinct. They're deity. And so we have evidence here to go ahead and suggest some of these qualities. We certainly can prove that the Shekinah is distinct from God because they're separate subjects and distinct actions in the same context. But you're going to go ahead and argue and say, well, that's a little bit much. You kind of guess the Shekinah was God. It doesn't specifically say the Shekinah is God in the context. Can you find any place where the glory of the Lord is equated with God more clearly? Because I just don't get it. In Leviticus 16:2, the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron your brother not to come in at just any time to the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat, which is on the ark, lest he die, for I will appear above the mercy seat." God says, I will appear above the mercy seat. Well, how does that help? Well, if you go on to 1 Samuel 4:4, so the people sent to Shiloh that they might bring from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. What's going on? The Shekinah dwells between the cherubim, but God says he dwells between the cherubim. Well, wait a minute. That's equating God with the Shekinah glory. That's a clearer verse, is it not? Is that not even clearer? It's clearer. And so we see that the Shekinah glory is distinct. He's identified with God. If you complain about the one verse, he's clearly identified with God in Samuel, because the two are both dwelling above the cherubim. God's very clear. It's holy ground. He's there. Deity's present, and the glory of the Lord is deity. And so we see that distinction, and we see deity, and we see personhood, really in those three sections. And so is there reason to go ahead and believe that there is distinction, multi-personhood, and deity existing within God? And I should say multiple persons being deity. Yes, we can see evidence of that. There are grounds for the Trinity. And I haven't even turned to the New Testament. This is not New Testament stuff. I've been hanging out in the Tanakh and even particularly in the Torah to go ahead and demonstrate that. And so we're wrapping up. This is again Zion's banner in beautiful California, going through and demonstrating plausibility to Jesus being the divine Son, because it is possible to have a divine Son, because the Trinity is plausible and reasonable.